Early morning wrapped the capital in a light haze, and the sun, lazily breaking through the tall buildings, revealed the hidden corners of Washington with its light. In front of the National Memorial, a crowd of tourists had gathered. People were chatting animatedly, exchanging jokes and clicking their cameras. Everyone wanted to take a piece of this place with them, a symbol of grandeur and discipline. Among the tightly packed rows of tourists, one man stood out, Dexter Feynman. Tall, lean, wearing an overly bright t-shirt with large letters reading, "Why so serious?" and a worn baseball cap, he drew attention to himself. Dexter seemed to enjoy the role of an invisible magician, skillfully directing the gazes of those around him. His loud, slightly hoarse voice easily overpowered the general hum. "Look, these guards don't even move," he exclaimed, addressing his friend standing nearby. "They're like mannequins. Why are they even posted here?" Elias, his childhood friend, cast a reproachful glance at him, nervously scratching the back of his neck. Tall and slightly hunched, Elias was the complete opposite of Dexter. He clearly felt uncomfortable. "Dex, maybe we should just watch the ceremony. This is a historic place," he suggested, avoiding the glances of passers-by. "Historic? Oh, come on, Elias. This is just a show for tourists," Dexter scoffed, gesturing broadly at the guards standing motionless in front of the memorial. "Just wait. I'll liven them up." "Dexter, don't," Claire interjected quietly. The girl with short blonde hair and a serious gaze stood patiently beside her friends, but her hands nervously fidgeted with the strap of her bag. "Relax, Claire. We're just having fun." Dexter smirked, his grin wide, but there was a spark of challenge in his eyes. The crowd around them began to murmur. Many cast disapproving glances at Dexter, but he seemed to enjoy it. His mannerisms and loud laughter sharply contrasted with the solemn atmosphere of anticipation. At the forefront stood 3 guards. Their scarlet uniforms and strict posture made them look like living statues. Gregory Whitmore, a young soldier with an air of commanding respect, stood in the center. His face remained impassive, as though carved from stone. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, and his hands gripped the rifle with its butt peeking out from beneath his scarlet coat. Noticing that one of the guards, the one in the center, hadn't blinked even once, Dexter smirked and pointed at Gregory. "There he is, the main mannequin. Look how he's standing. Do you think he's blinked even once in the last hour?" Dexter declared loudly, his voice echoing across the square. Nearby tourists murmured disapprovingly. Someone shook their head, but Dexter only chuckled. "Dex, you're going too far." Elias tried to reason with him again, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of the crowd. "Hey, what if I waved my hand in front of his face? Do you think he'd even look at me?" Dexter shouted, ignoring the indignant glances. Claire quietly muttered, "Dexter, stop." But he was already unstoppable. At the center of the crowd's attention, he felt like the star of a show. Dexter clapped his hands loudly and stepped up to the barrier. Gregory seemed not to notice. His face remained indifferent, his movements motionless. Yet if someone had looked closer, they might have noticed a barely perceptible tension in his jaw. "Unbelievable, he's just a doll," Dexter shouted, leaning closer. "Hey, you, Redcoat, I'm talking to you." At that moment, the silence that had descended on the square took on a heavy tone. All eyes were on Dexter, whose grin grew even wider. People held their breath, sensing the tension was about to break. Though no one yet knew what would happen, everyone could feel that this day would be unlike any other. The crowd seemed to fall silent, sensing the approach of a moment when the event would cease to be just a morning spectacle. Cameras, raised in anticipation of the traditional ceremony, now turned toward Dexter. His loud voice and provocative behavior had pushed the guards, meant to be the main focus of the morning, into the background. Gregory Whitmore remained motionless. His gaze was fixed in the distance, but inside, behind the impassive facade, emotions churned. Every morning began the same: uniform checks, strict instructions, and finally the reminder: you are a symbol of honor, a symbol of discipline. He repeated these words to himself like a mantra, but today, for the first time in a long while, Gregory felt his patience being tested to its limit. "Come on, man, show some reaction," Dexter continued, his voice growing louder, cutting through the morning air? Or is it written in your instructions to be soulless mannequins? Gregory didn't move. His breathing remained steady, his muscles tense like a steel spring. But in his mind, images were forming. Dexter, standing before him, was not just a tourist. In Gregory's eyes, he embodied everything disrespectful. To the uniform, to tradition, to people. Every gesture of this man, every loud laugh, grated on nerves that seemed impossible to shake. Among the crowd, a strange mixture of emotions was building. People whispered, some expressed clear disapproval, others outright irritation. A young woman holding a camera whispered to her companion, "This is too much. Why isn't anyone stopping him?" An elderly man in a hat standing nearby grumbled angrily, "This kid acts as if the rules don't apply to him. He probably never faced real consequences." Claire felt her heart clench. She had known Dexter for a long time, and this wasn't the first time his desire to stand out went too far. But in this moment, fear gripped her, not just for him, but for herself. Her palms sweated and her fingers clutched the bag strap so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She stepped closer to Dexter to stop him. "Dexter, please stop. You don't understand who you're joking with. These people, they're not just guards, they're trained to respond." But Dexter didn't hear her. His eyes burned with excitement. The crowd watched him, and that was all he needed. His voice grew louder, his gestures sharper. He felt like the director in the center of his own show. "What if I get closer?" he asked, more to the crowd than to his friends. His face twisted into a grin, his eyes throwing out a challenge. "Do you think he'll even blink?" "No, Dexter," Claire exclaimed, but her voice was drowned out by the surrounding noise. He stepped over the barrier. For Gregory, this moment became the point of no return. The internal voice urging him to remain calm fell silent. His muscles tightened further, like a coiled spring. The tourist hadn't just crossed a physical line, he had crossed a moral boundary. Memories of past instructions mixed with an instinctive sense of threat in Gregory's mind. He recalled the words of his senior officer, "Respect doesn't always come through silence." As Dexter drew closer, only a meter separated them. His face twisted into a provocative grin, and he raised his hand, waving it directly in front of Gregory's face. "Hey, you, can you hear me?" "I'm talking to you, red coat," Dexter said loudly. Gregory didn't flinch, but inside something had snapped. To him, Dexter wasn't just a tourist, he was someone testing his limits, someone embodying every ounce of disrespect. In Gregory's mind, he asked himself, what if this wasn't a tourist? What if this were a real threat? The crowd gasped as Dexter leaned even closer to the guard and tugged at the strap on his uniform. "He's gone too far," a woman in the crowd whispered. "Agreed. This isn't funny anymore." A man holding a phone responded, his device still aimed at the unfolding scene. Claire felt her legs weaken. Time seemed to slow. She knew something unforgettable was about to happen. Gregory took a step forward. His movement was quick and deliberate. Gripping the rifle firmly, he raised it with lightning speed and delivered a sharp strike to Dexter's side. The sound of the impact echoed across the square like a clap of thunder in clear skies. Dexter crumpled to the ground. His bright cap flew off and his face twisted in shock and pain. The crowd froze, unified by a mixture of fear, awe, and something indescribable. For a moment, silence blanketed the square. Gregory returned to his strict stance as if nothing had happened. His face remained as expressionless as before, and his posture was flawless, but his eyes still burned with inner tension. Dexter lay on the ground, his face a mix of pain and humiliation. For several seconds, he didn't move, as though unable to believe what had just happened to him. The crowd, previously buzzing with conversation, was now completely silent. Every movement and word carried weight, and the air between people felt thick with tension. Gregory Whitmore stood motionless, as if indifferent to what had just occurred. He returned to his impeccably measured stance, with his rifle in its proper place, and his gaze fixed straight ahead. But inside, everything churned. His heart pounded so hard he feared its sound might echo louder than the rifle's strike. This shouldn't have happened, but he forced me to act, he thought. Dexter began to stir. His friends rushed to him, their faces filled with horror. Claire was the first to grab his hand, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, Dex, are you okay?" "What were you thinking?" Elias supported him by the elbow, helping him to stand. He looked bewildered, his voice barely audible. "I told you to stop. Why didn't you listen?" Dexter began, but his voice broke. He coughed, clutching his side where the strike had landed. "He actually hit me. This is insane." His words came out louder than he intended. Some people in the crowd averted their eyes, while others looked at him with curiosity and thinly veiled satisfaction. For many, this was a moment of justice. A man who had provoked for too long had finally gotten what he deserved. But not everyone shared that view. "That was too much," a woman's voice rang out from the crowd. The young woman, still filming the scene on her phone, frowned. "The guard shouldn't have reacted like that. He's just a tourist." Her words sparked a wave of murmurs. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked at her disapprovingly. "Just a tourist?" An elderly man in a hat grumbled loudly. "This just a tourist crossed the barriers and broke all the rules. He got what he deserved." "But violence, it's wrong," the woman continued, though her voice sounded less confident now. Claire felt panic rising within her. It seemed as though the situation was spiraling out of control, growing like a snowball and becoming more unmanageable. She grabbed Dexter by the shoulders, shaking him. "Why didn't you stop? Did you see who you were messing with? These people, they're not for jokes. This isn't a circus, Dexter." "I just wanted to show them they're human too," he muttered, but his voice lacked the confidence it usually carried. Inside, fear began to grow. He looked at the crowd, which now focused not on the guards but on him. Judgment, anger, curiosity. They all mixed in their gazes, and each was unbearable for him. "It's just a circus," he muttered again, trying to justify himself, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Elias shook his head. "This wasn't a circus, Dexter. This was serious." Meanwhile, the officers assigned to the memorial, stationed nearby, noticed the commotion. Two of them, dressed in sharp uniforms, began making their way through the crowd. Their authoritative presence commanded attention, and people instinctively stepped aside to let them pass. "Here they come," someone in the crowd whispered. "Now it's going to get real." When the officers approached Dexter, one of them, a man in his late 40s with a cropped haircut and a stern expression, stopped in front of him. He studied the tourist for a few seconds as though assessing whether the situation warranted intervention. "You violated protocol," the officer said loudly and clearly, ensuring the entire crowd could hear. "Leave the premises immediately." "Violated?" Dexter snapped, though his voice was shaky. Your mannequin hit me. This is unacceptable. I'll file a complaint." The officer's expression didn't change. His voice remained calm but firm. "You crossed a restricted boundary. Your actions posed a potential threat to security. The guard's response was proportional. Leave now, or we will involve the police." These words felt like the final blow to Dexter. He glanced at the officer, then at Gregory, who stood motionless, as though the incident hadn't involved him at all. Dexter's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Shame, anger, and fear all collided. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but no words came to him. The crowd's eyes burned into him, making every second unbearable. He began, but fell silent when he realized he had nothing to say. The crowd buzzed with whispers as discussions began anew. Some openly scorned Dexter, while others tried to defend him. A man holding a phone shouted, "This video needs to go online. Let people see how these guards handle things. It's a lesson for anyone who thinks they can break the rules. Or for anyone who thinks guards can act however they want," a young woman countered, still recording the scene on her phone. Regardless of their opinions, everyone agreed on one thing. This incident was unforgettable. Dexter, now limping slightly, began to leave the square, supported by Claire and Elias. The crowd parted to let them pass, but the atmosphere was thick with judgment. For some, he symbolized what happens when respect for tradition is ignored. For others, he was a victim of excessive discipline. As they approached the edge of the square, Claire stopped abruptly. Without turning to face Dexter, she said quietly but sharply, "You just don't get it, do you? The world doesn't revolve around you. You're lucky this didn't end worse, but you've earned your lesson today." Dexter didn't respond. He simply lowered his head, his confidence shattered for the first time in years. Meanwhile, Gregory remained at his post, his heart gradually settling into a steady rhythm. Yet the weight of the day's events still pressed heavily on his shoulders. He knew the crowd's eyes were on him, and though they had begun to disperse, he felt their lingering judgment. I did what I had to do, Gregory thought. He repeated the words to himself, trying to convince himself they were true. But deep down, doubt gnawed at him. Was it too much? Should I have handled it differently, he wondered. But as the senior officer approached him, his focus returned to the present. Whitmore, the officer said sternly, be prepared for scrutiny. This incident will be reviewed, and every action you took will be evaluated. Gregory straightened, his expression unreadable. Yes, sir, he replied, his voice calm but firm. Inside, he braced himself for the consequences that would surely follow. The crowd gradually dispersed, leaving behind an atmosphere of tension that seemed to hang in the air like a lingering storm. For those who had witnessed the events of that morning, it was a memory that would not fade quickly. Dexter, Claire, and Elias moved through the quieter streets of Washington, heading toward a small cafe just off the main square. Dexter's steps were slower than usual, not from pain but from the weight of what had transpired. He avoided Claire's and Elias's eyes, his usual bravado replaced with silence. Inside the cafe, the three friends sat at a corner table. The bright sunlight streaming through the window seemed almost out of place against the somber mood that hung over them. Dexter stared into his untouched coffee, occasionally rubbing his side where the guard had struck him. Claire and Elias sat opposite him, their expressions a mix of concern and frustration. I didn't mean for it to go that far, Dexter finally said, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was quiet, almost unrecognizable. I thought it would be funny. I didn't want... You didn't want what? Claire cut in sharply. Her arms were crossed, and her tone carried the weight of unspoken anger. You didn't want to get hurt? You didn't want everyone to look at you like you're a complete idiot? Dexter flinched slightly but didn't look up. You never think, Dexter. Everything's a joke to you, a chance to be the center of attention. Claire continued, her voice rising slightly. But this isn't about you. It's about respect, something you clearly don't understand. Elias, who had been quiet until now, nodded in agreement. We tried to stop you, Dex. We told you to let it go. But you just had to keep pushing. Maybe now you'll understand that being loud doesn't mean you're right. Dexter finally looked up, his eyes meeting theirs. For a moment, his usual defiance flickered, but it quickly faded. I get it, he said softly. I really do. Claire sighed, her anger subsiding slightly. I hope you do, Dex, because this isn't just about today. It's about how you are all the time. You've got to change. Back at the guard station, Gregory stood in the locker room, the scarlet uniform that had become an extension of himself hanging neatly on its rack. His bearskin hat rested on the shelf above, and his polished boots stood aligned beneath. Gregory stared at his reflection in the small mirror above the sink. The face that looked back at him was calm, disciplined, but the storm within him remained. He clenched the edge of the sink, his knuckles turning white. The events of the morning replayed in his mind. The tourist stepping over the barrier, the taunts, the decision to act. Gregory had been trained to endure, to remain impassive no matter what. But today that training had faltered. The door behind him opened, and the senior officer entered. His measured steps echoed in the quiet room as he approached Gregory. Whitmore, the officer said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of authority, the incident from this morning is already being reviewed. There will be an inquiry, and your actions will be scrutinized. Be prepared for the questions that will come. Yes, sir, Gregory replied, his tone neutral. The officer studied him for a moment, then continued. I understand why you acted the way you did. The tourist crossed a line, both physically and morally. But as a guard, your role is to maintain control, not to escalate. This will not be easy for you, but remember, you are a symbol of discipline. Even in moments like this, especially in moments like this, you must embody that discipline. Gregory nodded, his shoulders straightening. Understood, sir. Meanwhile, the footage of the morning's events spread across social media like wildfire. Clips of the guard striking Dexter were shared thousands of times, each post sparking heated debates. Some hailed Gregory as a hero who stood up for tradition and respect. Others condemned him, accusing him of using excessive force. Finally, someone shows these disrespectful tourists they can't act however they want. one comment read. This is unacceptable. Guards are supposed to symbolize control and restraint, countered another. Memes and edited videos flooded the internet. In one clip, dramatic music was added to the moment Gregory struck Dexter, with captions like, "When patience runs out." Another portrayed Dexter as a cartoonish villain, repeatedly stepping over the barrier in slow motion. The public debate grew louder. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting the footage alongside interviews with experts debating the guard's actions and the tourist behavior. The next morning, the square in front of the memorial returned to its usual rhythm. Tourists gathered, cameras clicked, and the disciplined guards stood in their iconic scarlet uniforms, maintaining their stoic presence. For most, it was just another day, another ceremony. But for those who had witnessed the events of the previous morning, the memory lingered. Gregory Whitmore was back at his post, his posture as impeccable as ever. Yet something about his demeanor had changed. His gaze, though fixed straight ahead, carried a depth of understanding that hadn't been there before. Discipline isn't just about standing still, he thought. It's about making the hard decisions and living with them. For Dexter, the day would remain etched in his memory as a turning point. Sitting in his apartment that evening, he scrolled through social media, seeing his face in countless videos and posts. The comments, both supportive and mocking, cut deeper than he expected. For the first time, he understood that his actions had consequences, not just for himself, but for those around him. "They're right," he admitted to himself. "I crossed the line." For Gregory, the incident became a lesson in balance. He had acted decisively, but he knew the weight of his decision would stay with him. As the world debated his actions, he stood firm, confident that he had done what he believed was necessary. And for the crowd that had gathered that morning, the event was a stark reminder of boundaries, both physical and moral. Respect, they realized, was not just a courtesy, but a necessity. The square, bathed in the soft light of a new day, carried on. The guards stood tall, silent symbols of tradition and honor, as tourists admired their discipline with a newfound respect.